Hi, I'm Deanne Akers-Lons from Canada Abroad, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most commonly asked questions that we get. How can I get Canadian citizenship? The first way that people can get Canadian citizenship is through descent. And the way that the Citizenship Act works right now is descent is pretty much limited to the first generation. And what we mean by this is if your parent was born in Canada, and you were born outside of Canada, you could still get your Canadian citizenship. However, if your parent is a Canadian citizen, but they were born outside of Canada, and you were then born outside of Canada, you could not get your Canadian citizenship. So let's say I'm Canadian, I was born in Canada, I moved abroad, and I had a child in South Africa. That child is a Canadian citizen and can get their Canadian citizenship. If they then have their own child outside of Canada, that child, my grandchild, would not get their Canadian citizenship because they would be the second generation born outside of Canada. Now, there are some exemptions to this that go back quite a ways. If it's more recent, likely you're not going to get your citizenship. If it's more of an older generation person looking at their citizenship, they could potentially get it. So you could always contact us for more details. We would need to know who's involved, where they were born, what their parent status was when they were born abroad. Because in some cases, if you were born abroad, but your parents were stationed overseas for military purposes or certain government purposes, you're not considered born outside of Canada. So there are some funny exemptions to that rule, but in general, it is limited to the first descent. For those individuals who are permanent residents of Canada, so you might have been on a work permit first or a study permit, or you just got direct permanent residency, and you're looking to get your Canadian citizenship, you need to first prove that you've been physically present in Canada for at least 3 in the last 5 years. So they look at it within a 5-year period as a permanent resident. So they're not going to say, okay, you've been here for 3 years on a work permit, you can apply for citizenship. You need to have been on permanent residency status, okay? The next thing they want to see is that if you were required to file your taxes, that you did. So if you're working in Canada, that you're declaring your income, filing your taxes. You would also have to do a citizenship test, and you would also have to prove your language abilities in French or English. Now, if you were in Canada on temporary status like a work permit or a student permit before becoming a permanent resident, you might be able to use some of this time towards the days spent in Canada for your citizenship calculation. So for this, they would look at any time that you spent in Canada on a valid work or study permit, or a visitor permit or a temporary resident permit in the last 5 years. And for every day that you spent in Canada on one of those permits, you can count it as a half day in Canada. So if you spent 2 years in Canada on one of those temporary resident permits, it equates to 1 year in Canada. So just divide by 2, and that's what you can claim. But you can only claim up to a maximum of 1 year. So you can't claim the full 3-year requirement using those temporary permits. You can only use it for credit of up to 365 days. The other 2 years would have had to have been in Canada as a permanent resident. To file your citizenship application, you can download the application through the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship website. Once you have everything together, you're going to need to pay the required application fee, which is $630 Canadian for adults and then $100 Canadian for anyone under the age of 18. The current processing time for citizenship applications is 12 months. So once you've lodged the application, you can expect it to take 12 months before you would hear back and actually get your Canadian citizenship. So just keep that in mind. If you are on permanent residency status, if your permanent resident card is going to expire in that time, you would want to renew it so that you have that so you can travel in and out, because you can't apply for the Canadian passport until you have your proof of Canadian citizenship. Now, in terms of the Canadian citizenship test, a lot of people say, well, who needs to take this test? And not everybody does. Only those applying for citizenship between the ages of 18 and 54 need to actually do the citizenship test. So if you're under 18 or you're 55 or older, then you're exempt from having to take the actual test. Now, for those that need to do the citizenship test, we get asked a lot, is it difficult? Is it hard? So the test itself takes about 30 minutes to complete. It's only offered in English or French, and it consists of 20 questions, which are multiple choice or true and false. Now, the test looks at a variety of different topics. So geography, history, the economy, the Canadian government, the laws of Canada, and the symbols of Canada. And you can definitely study for the test. The government has resources online, PDFs, MP3s, things that you can take on the go and study. So as long as you put some study and some effort into it, you should have no issues with this test, especially if you've been living in Canada for 3 of the last 5 years. Now, some examples of the questions that you can expect on the test. They give quite a list. So let's see. How are members of Parliament chosen? A, they're appointed by the United Nations. B, they're appointed by the provincial premiers. C, they're elected by voters in their local constituencies or ridings. Or D, they're elected by landowners and police chiefs. Well, the answer is C. Another question, we won't give you the answers and the options, but why do we wear a poppy for Remembrance Day? That's one of the questions. What does the word Inuit mean? So there's definitely things that are specific to Canada, and if you've been living here, some of them you would know without even having to study, but they give you a long list of sample questions with answers. So there's a lot of information out there that you can study, and they're not really that complicated of a question. So quite easy to answer. It's all multiple choice, true, false, so it makes it a little bit easier for you. No long-winded written essays as well. So if you're nervous about it, study ahead of time and you should be fine. Now, when it comes to the language abilities requirement, this is also not for everybody. Only those people applying who are between 18 and 54 have to prove that they are fluent in French or English. Now, in order to prove that you are fluent, you have to reach the CLB level 4 on an approved language test. If you fall below that level, you won't be able to get your citizenship. So you'll have to keep studying and practice until you can get to that level. So also, there's the option if you completed your high school or your post-secondary education in English or French, you can send the documents to prove that, to use that as your proof of English or French proficiency for the citizenship language test requirement. Now, with the citizenship test, because it's only 20 questions, you would think, okay, I passed this 50%, I only need to get 10 right. Well, unfortunately, that's not correct. You have to get 15 out of 20. So if you do not get 15 questions correct, you're going to fail the test, unfortunately, and have to rewrite it. So keep that in mind as well when you're practicing for the test. You have to get over that 50% mark to pass. Now, when it comes to minors who are applying for Canadian citizenship, it's going to differ for those minors who either have a Canadian parent or their parent is applying for citizenship at the same time as them. And then those that do not have a Canadian parent and don't have a parent applying at the same time. So the first scenario is if you do have a Canadian parent or a parent who's applying for citizenship at the same time, those individuals don't have to do the language test. They don't have to prove that they've physically been present in Canada for 3 of the 5 years as a permanent resident. They would have to do a citizenship oath if they're 14 or older, and their parent or guardian has to sign the application on their behalf if they're under 14. Those minors also don't have to prove that they meet the language requirements in French or English, but they do have to be on permanent residency status in Canada. Now, for those individuals who do not have a Canadian parent or they don't have a parent applying for citizenship at the same time, they need to prove that they are a permanent resident at the time of their application. They do not have to meet the language test requirements. If applicable, they would have to show that they filed their income taxes, only again if it's applicable to them. Some minors might have to, some might not. They would have to prove that they've physically been present in Canada for 3 of the last 5 years. If they're 14 or over, they would have to do the citizenship oath and they can sign their own application. If they're under 14, then their guardian is going to need to sign it on their behalf. So once your application for citizenship has been approved, you will go to a citizenship ceremony and you will do the oath of citizenship and be given your certificate. That is your proof of Canadian citizenship. You can then use it to get your Canadian passport. At the moment, at the time of recording, we are in a pandemic, so the citizenship oaths are not being done in person. So depending at the time of your application, hopefully we will be back to normal and you will be doing those in person with a group of new citizens with you. So that's been the general overview of how to get Canadian citizenship. If your scenario was not covered, feel free to contact us and we can see if we can assist you in determining if you are a Canadian citizen or not, or if you're eligible to apply to be a Canadian citizen. So thanks for tuning in, and we hope that this answered your questions.